This is Cyberpunk at 4K with maxed out ray traced settings on an RTX 5090, which can draw up to 600 watts, but yet the GPU's only drawing 350 watts, which kinda begs the question, why? And that's because the stated power draw of a GPU isn't quite as simple as some people explain it to be, which I wanted to discuss in this video, along with discussing why many gamers won't actually be affected by melting 12-volt power connectors. And obviously some people are affected by it, I'm not denying that, but I think many gamers aren't going to be as susceptible as some people might think, which I'll discuss throughout this video, but also particularly at the end of this video. But first I wanted to discuss TDP, and why that's not always the same thing as the actual GPU power draw. They're two completely different things, and this is a common misunderstanding. So when a graphics card lists the wattage figure, that's often the TDP, or the thermal design power of that graphics card, and often that is going to be very similar to the power draw of the card at its absolute peak, but it's not exactly the same thing as like the average GPU power draw, and that's because the TDP is actually a representation of the cooling capacity and capability of that particular graphics card, and that is very similar to the power draw at its peak, but there is also a subtle difference. So let's say you've got an RTX 5070 Ti, that can use up to 350 watts for example, and as a result the cooling package of that GPU, meaning the heatsink, the fans and everything else, that has to support around 350 watts of course, and that's different to how much power draw the graphics card uses, because if you've got a 5070 Ti and maybe you game at a slightly lower resolution like 1080p and you put on DLSS and maybe you have a frame cap, it's not going to use anywhere near 350 watts. It's only when you actually game natively at like 4K and push everything to the absolute max, you might then get that 350 watt power draw figure. And that's why I say that TDP is different to the actual GPU power draw, because they are two different things. The TDP is a measure of the cooling capacity of the card, whereas the power draw depends on what games you play and the graphical settings and everything else. And that brings us nicely to our second point, which is that the games you play and the game engine that's in use, and also your own graphical settings, they make an absolutely massive difference to the power draw of a GPU. So if you play a game like Cyberpunk or Indiana Jones, and when you crank up all the settings to the max, and you don't have any DLSS upscaling or anything like that, then your graphics card's probably going to use the maximum GPU power draw it's actually rated for. But if you play a slightly older game, or maybe you dial down some of the graphical settings, then it's probably not going to use that full listed power draw. Equally, if you're playing a game like Cyberpunk and your GPU is drawing like 550 watts, let's say you've got an RTX 5090, and then you lower down the graphical settings and maybe turn off ray tracing and then enable VSync or a frame rate cap, and I'll talk more about that particular point in a minute, but if you enable some of those settings, you might see a power draw go down from 550 watts to 400 watts or below, and that's an absolutely massive, substantial difference just by changing a few things. And sometimes, you know, the graphical difference in those two settings isn't actually all that much, but the actual power draw is substantially different. Equally, if you've got 4K monitors, but then in the game you actually set a lower resolution, that's obviously going to be hitting the GPU less. It's going to be less demanding for the GPU because there's less pixels, and as a result there's going to be less power draw from that GPU, and that's actually quite a key point, and that's why upscaling is so important, and I'm going to talk about that more in the next point. But first I wanted to quickly reiterate that the actual game engine and the type of games you're playing can make a massive difference to the power draw too. For example, we know that UE5, Unreal Engine 5, can result in some really buggy, unoptimized games, not always, but in many cases. And you take Borderlands 4 for example, it's not even that graphically good, but yet it's really demanding on the GPU just because the developers of that game didn't code it up very well, and as a result your GPU is going to have to work harder just to get a half decent gaming experience. But if you then contrast that to like Battlefield 6, then your graphics card doesn't have to work as hard to actually generate a good, acceptable gaming experience. And obviously it's hard to compare two different games, but in general, you know, how the game is coded and the game engine that's used can make a massive difference to the power draw from your graphics card, assuming you have an FPS cap, and I've mentioned that a few times. I'm going to talk about it more, you know, towards the end of this video. Equally, the type of game you play actually matters quite a lot. For example, strategy games like City Skyline or Total War tend to have so much going on in there, then it can actually hammer your CPU as well, and not just your GPU. So you might find that because there's loads going on there, sometimes the graphics card is waiting for the CPU to do stuff, such as calculating how things are going on the battlefield in Total War, for example, and as a result of that, the CPU is obviously doing a little bit more work and the GPU cannot work too hard. So for those type of games, even though you might get quite high GPU power draw, it might not be as much compared to a game like Indiana Jones or Cyberpunk, where the GPU is even more important. So just in general, if you've got a bit of a bottleneck that's not a GPU bottleneck, then that's going to limit your GPU power draw. Next up, do you remember when the RTX 50 series came out and loads of YouTubers were completely bashing it, saying how awful the gen-on-gen gains are? You know, they were saying the 5080 only has like 5 to 10% improvement over the 4080 4080 and the 4080 Super, and people were really critical of the 50 series in general. And that isn't just because NVIDIA have forgotten us gamers and they're obsessed with AI, and both of those things are kind of true, but it's also because Moore's Law is dead. So Moore's Law is all about the fact that every 2 years, the number of transistors on a PCB will double, which is roughly equivalent to the amount of computing power can actually double every 2 years. It's not quite the same thing, but that's an easier way of thinking about it. However, nowadays, the microchips on a GPU are so unbelievably tiny, they measured in single-digit nanometers, that it's almost impossible to keep that trend going of doubling computing power every 2 years. And because Moore's Law is dead, or at least slowing down, that means that Intel, NVIDIA, and AMD have instead been looking at more software-based improvements for their graphics cards instead of improving the raw rendering potential of the GPUs. And the good news is that actually enabling, upscaling and frame gen will result in less power draw, because, if you've got a 4K monitor, then when you enable DLSS, then internally the game might only be rendering at 1080p or 1440p. What that means is it's less power draw. Literally the game is being rendered at a lower base resolution with less pixels, and as a result, the GPU needs to work less hard, which is going back to one of my earlier points. And even a power-hungry GPU like the RTX 5090, for example, which is rated for 600 watts, you might find that by enabling upscaling and reducing some of your graphical settings might suddenly see you use up like 300 watts and not 600 watts, which is crazy when you think about it. Because Moore's Law is dead, these GPU companies are focusing more on software improvements, and simply by tweaking one or two options in some drop-down boxes, your GPU might use like a third less power, or even if it's a fifth less power, that is still quite a significant gain. And that's something that sometimes people aren't talking about enough on Reddit, because people post a picture of their new RTX 5080 and people just say, oh my god, it uses 400 watts, you're a noob, it's going to melt. But often, many gamers are just going to be going into a game and just playing it, and if DLSS is on by default because, the NVIDIA app has optimized the game and enabled those settings, then many gamers aren't actually going to realize. They're just going to turn on the game and play the game and enjoy it. And if then DLSS means that 5080 is only drawing 250 watts or 300 watts of power instead of, 380 watts or 400 watts, then so be it. Most gamers won't actually care about that. But because it's then drawing a lot less power, there's then less risk to the 12-volt power connector. Equally, many modern graphics cards supports frame gen, which I know there's debate about fake frames and things like that, but if you've actually tried it yourself, frame generation can work very, very well, especially 2x frame gen in single-player games. That can be brilliant and not affect input latency much at all. And the benefit of frame generation is then that allows you to achieve your monitor's refresh rate a lot easier. So let's say you're playing a game with frame gen off and you're getting like 60 or 70 FPS on average. You could then enable 2x frame gen and maybe get up to 120 FPS quite easily. So then if your monitor is 120 Hz or 144 Hz, you could almost just say, yeah, that'll be fine, because effectively then, you've hit your monitor's refresh rate target, you don't need more frames than that, and then suddenly your GPU needs to use less power. And that brings me to my fourth point, which is undervolting. And many normal gamers might not look into this, but actually many graphics cards have a lot of headroom. For example, the GPU maker, when they're actually packaging up that graphics card, they might set the frequency and the voltage to a particular level that they know, all of their graphics cards can run at with no issues whatsoever. But in, 99% of cases, you can actually lower the voltage that your graphics card is running at, and then something magic happens. And it's not magic, but what can happen is because your voltage is lower on the GPU, it's then using substantially less power for the same level of performance or very similar. And for example, an RTX 5090, which is rated for 600 watts, you can actually undervolt that so it only uses around 450 watts when gaming, with only like a 5% performance hit, which is crazy. It might be using like 20-25% less power for only 5% less performance hit. And this applies to pretty much every graphics card, not just the super high-end ones. A mid-range graphics card can also be undervolted and use substantially less power, and then place less risk on the 12-volt power connectors if your graphics card has that, for example. And I'll talk more about 12-volt power in a minute, but next I wanted to talk about silicon lottery. And this is the idea that every graphics card is slightly different. You're never going to get two things on the PCB that is exactly the same. So when you see a YouTuber show off their graphics card and maybe it uses, 450 watts on average when playing a particular game, it might be that if you buy that exact GPU, you might actually see that the average power draw is like 430 watts instead of 450 watts. You might also find that if you undervolt it, suddenly you get an average power draw of like 320 watts, whereas that YouTuber's one that they use for that review might only go to like 340 watts, for example. So in other words, you've won the silicon lottery and they haven't, which is again something that's not often discussed when people think about power draw. They just think, ooh, RTX 4090, 450 watts, it's going to melt. But actually, based on the games you play and the game engine and the graphical settings and the silicon lottery, and whether you undervolt or not, your power draw can be substantially less than 450 watts. Equally, when you're reading those reviews or watching those YouTube videos and you see, an RTX 5080 use 400 watts or a 5090 use 600 watts, you've got to remember that often for those particular tests, they are designed to push the GPU to the absolute max, often using a program like FreeSync, so that is designed to use, the maximum power capacity of a GPU and really, really stress it. But on average, when you're actually gaming, you're not going to see that much of a power draw in many cases. I mean, you might do in 1 or 2 cases, but many normal gamers will just launch a game, not really care if DLSS is on or not, and then play a game at a fraction of the GPU's maximum power draw potential. And finally, I wanted to talk about frame caps because I've talked about this a lot earlier on, but effectively, your monitor has a refresh rate measured in hertz, which is the number of images every single second that a monitor can display. And this is where frame caps come in, and it can make a massive difference to the power draw of your GPU and ultimately your electric bill too. Because if a monitor has like a 144 Hz refresh rate like this one does, or a 60 Hz refresh rate like this one, and let's say I'm playing a game on this particular monitor, there's no point of my graphics card spitting out more than 60 frames, because this is a 60 Hz monitor, it can't show more than 60 frames. So if I then go into my game and I enable a frame rate cap or VSync, and there's pros and cons to each of those methods, I'll put more details in the description, but if I do that, then basically my graphics card will never spit out more than 60 frames, and as I mentioned earlier, that's going to be less demanding on the GPU, so the power draw will be lower. And for example, my son likes playing Farming Simulator 2025, and he's only 6, he's not that interested in the actual visual fidelity and, whether you're going to have slight ghosting in certain circumstances, he just wants to play the freaking game. And as a result, what I often do is set the resolution to 1440p, I put the graphical settings as medium, I put a frame rate cap on, and I enable DLSS, and often then the graphics card is only drawing 100 to 200 watts, which is substantially less than, the graphics card is rated for, but actually the game still looks very, very good. And that's not me being unfair on my son, by the way, he's only 6, he doesn't need to game at like 4K native, and also sometimes he wanders off and just leaves the game running, and I don't really want it drawing like, 400 watts or 600 watts, which is why I've actually dialed down the settings a bit, because it's easier to stomach, 150 watts being wasted than, 600 watts or whatever. So as you can probably tell, there's actually a substantial amount of things that go into how much power your actual graphics card uses, and that's why when people talk about the 12-volt power connector and they post loads of memes on Reddit, whilst they are right and, people are rightly angry about the 12-volt power connector, it's worth remembering that just because you buy a particular graphics card, it's not guaranteed to melt. I mean, it's different if you have a 5090 and you run FreeSync on it 24/7, pulling 600 watts of power through these tiny, tiny cables and connector, then that is more of a risk. But if you're a typical gamer and you game with upscaling on and you're happy to dial down some of the settings, then you are less at risk of actually having melting 12-volt power cables. And certainly nothing is certain when it comes to 12-volt power, and that's because NVIDIA designed their RTX 40 and 50 cards in such a way that there's no load balancing on each individual wire, and as a result, we can't completely protect ourselves, which sucks. But I do have a separate video talking about how you can slightly reduce the chances of melting 12-volt power over here if you want to check that out. If you've got any further questions though, please leave them in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button, and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.